All right, 1 second. Okay, it says we are live, but just give me 1 second to just confirm that it's running. All right, 1 second. All right, so we are running. So we're good to go. So Michela, we're happy to hear your talk today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see the handout?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So thank you guys for having me here and for having the passion to listen to my talk. I want also to thank Greg. He already read my talk and give some suggestions and comments, which made things much more complicated and interesting for me. And so I started. Anyone like Hegel and Priest who intends to argue that there are two contradictions must necessarily face the problem of explosion. According to the principle of explosion, the assertion of the truth of a contradiction within a system implies the truth of any proposition of the system itself. That is, the contradiction trivializes the system. Both Hegel and Priest are particularly careful to distance themselves from the so-called trivialism, that is, from the thesis that all contradictions are true. For a dialectist, only some contradictions are true. At the beginning of the article, What is so bad about contradiction? Priest states the following. I shall address the title question, and the answer I shall give is maybe nothing much. Let me first explain how exactly the question is to be understood. I shall interpret it to mean what is wrong with believing some contradiction. I emphasize the some. The question, what is wrong with believing all contradiction, is quite different, and I'm sure has a different answer. It is important to emphasize this distinction right at the start, since the illicit slide between some and all is endemic in discussion of the question. So, likewise, the Hegelian thesis of the truth of contradiction must also, I think, be distinguished from trivialism. In the Doctrine of Essence, Hegel claims that everything is inherently contradictory. This claim might lead us to think of Hegel as a trivialist. However, Hegel is not claiming that all contradictions are true. He's claiming that all things are in themselves contradictory. That is to say, he's claiming that the way everything is determined implies some kind of contradictory structure. Furthermore, Hegel seems to be well aware of the dangers of explosion. The explosion of the logical system that can result from the admission of the truth of even a single contradiction must be avoided, must be mastered, in order to prevent the truth of contradiction from implying everything. In the third remark, following the analysis of the category of contradiction in the Doctrine of Essence, Hegel writes the following. This is point 2 of the handout. Speculative thought consists only in this, in holding firm to contradiction and to itself in contradiction, but not in the sense that, as it happens in ordinary thought, it would let itself be ruled by it and allow it to dissolve its determinations into just other determinations or into nothing. End of quote. So if we follow Hegel's and Priest's lines of thought, I think we need to ask how it is possible to distinguish true contradiction from false contradictions. In other words, we have to face the problem of the exclusion of the contradiction that need to be rejected as false. Put differently, the thesis that some contradictions are true and the rejection of trivialism implies the exclusion of the truth of some contradictions. In Priest's Dialetheism and Hegel's Dialectic, a criterion must be provided in order to exclude false contradictions from the set of contradictions that are claimed to be true, and a tool to express this exclusion must be offered. In this sense, Hegel and Priest must be able to defend the thesis of the truth of some contradictions without losing the determinacy of meaning of the thought and the language that expresses these theses. Differently put, they must be able to exclude the truth of the contradiction that is reasonable to admit as false, as well as to exclude the truth of all the other sentences for which there are good evidences to believe to be false. This means that the theories of Hegel and Priest presupposes some coherent way of conceiving of true contradictions, according to which I cannot say everything on its contrary, since I can only assume the truth of those contradictions which I have good reason to believe to be true. The problem of exclusion is widely discussed in the contemporary debate over dialetheism. Of course, this same problem must also be faced, I think, by anyone who wants to take Hegel's thesis of the truth of contradiction seriously. The aim of my talk is to present the way in which Priest and Hegel face the problem of exclusion and to investigate the implications of the different strategies they endorse. To address this problem, I will consider 2 points. The first one, how do Hegel and Priest distinguishes true contradiction from false contradictions? And the second one, how do Hegel and Priest express the exclusion of false contradictions and, more generally, of everything they do not claim to be true? Let's start with the first part of the talk, which is focused on the distinction between true contradiction and false contradictions. The problem of the first part of the talk is the following. Considering that both Hegel and Priest claim that some contradictions are true, they do have to offer a criterion for distinguishing true contradiction from false ones. If the criterion in question is a formal criterion, we have no criterion at all. However, this does not seem to be a serious problem for either Hegel or Priest. Priest's justification runs as follows. I am frequently asked for a criterion as to when contradictions are acceptable and when they are not. It would be nice if there were a substantial answer to this question, or even if one could give a partial answer in the form of some algorithm to demonstrate that an area of discourse is contradiction-free. But I doubt that this is possible, nor is this a matter of surprise. Few would now seriously suppose that one can give an algorithm or any other informative criterion to determine when it is rational to accept something. There is no reason why the fact that something has a certain syntactic form, be it P and not P, or anything else, should change this. One can determine the acceptability of any given contradiction as of anything else only on its individual merits. End of quote. So, Priest's position on the possibility to provide a syntactic criterion for distinguishing true contradiction from false one is simple. We just need to ask the following question. Is it possible to provide a formal syntactic criterion for knowing what is reasonable to accept or not accept in the case of non-contradictory sentences? Of course, the answer is no. There are no merely syntactic criteria for evaluating whether a coherent sentence is true or false. It is necessary, in each case, to take into account the specific sentence, and having established a verification criterion, one has to determine whether the sentence in question is true or false. Now, if the advocate of the classical logic is not obliged to provide a syntactic criterion of the kind described, why should one ask the dialectist to offer such kind of criterion? What Priest is asking us, if I got it right, if one wants to accept the challenge to think of the truth of contradiction, is to consider contradictory sentences in the same way as non-contradictory ones, and to evaluate truth and falsehood on the basis of the individual merit of each specific sentence. I think that Hegel's solution to this problem goes in a similar direction. The impossibility of assuming any a priori syntactic principle to determine the truth and falsity of contradiction depends mainly on 2 points. The first one, philosophy as science is voraussetzung los. That is, it is without presupposition, and therefore one cannot assume a priori the validity of any logical principle that determine the development of the dialectical process. The second point, the dialectical process does not depend in any way on the syntactic form of the sentences that express the content of logical determination. but it depends only on the very content of this determination. And here I want to focus that the problem is that with the syntactic form, which is not equivalent to the logical form of thought determination, which I consider as equivalent to the content of logical determination. Therefore, asking Hegel for a syntactic criterion to determine which contradiction he is willing to accept as true and which should be rejected means not having understood the dynamics through which the Hegelian dialectic works. However, the impossibility to distinguish true contradiction from false contradiction on the basis of purely syntactic criterion does not mean that Hegel and Priest do not have some criterion available to implement this distinction. Priest, in particular, speaks of the individual merits of propositions that one can accept or reject. In the same way, Hegel does not accept the truth of every contradiction, but only of those contradictions that are implied by the dialectical process itself. This means that we have to consider the individual merits of each logical structure, and one can do this only by making explicit the logical content of each determination. In this sense, the only principle that Priest adopts to identify true contradiction is what he calls the principle of rationality. And I quote, "If you have good evidence for the truth of A, you ought to accept A." So Priest's idea is that if I have good reason for accepting a certain belief as true, it is reasonable to do so, and this obviously applies even if the belief in question is of a contradictory nature. This means that the dialetheist can accept both A and not A if there are good reasons for the truth of both. I think a similar principle could be considered as valid in Hegel's dialectic, and the principle would sound something like this. In the development of the logical system, it is reasonable to accept as true everything that the content of each logical determination implies, that is, everything that results from the process of making explicit the content of logical determination. In this sense, the counterpart of Priest's principle of rationality would be Hegel's principle of dialectical reason, which consists in the dialectical process itself. Let's see how this works with a couple of examples. A paradigmatic example in Priest's dialetheism is what happens with the paradoxes of self-reference. And here we refer in particular to the liar paradox. As you all know, the liar paradox is a sentence that predicates its own falsehood, and if what the liar says is true, then it is false, and vice versa. The self-contradictory conclusion of the liar paradox, according to Priest, is a case of true contradiction. To demonstrate this, Priest takes into account the two main strategies for solving the liar paradox, which are meant to show that the paradoxical character of the liar sentence is only an apparent one. And the two strategies to resolve the paradox are: the first one, denying the possibility of defining the truth predicate for a language within that language, and the second one is a criticism of the principle of equivalence. Therefore, first of all, Priest shows that all the solutions based on these strategies are unsuccessful for different kinds of reasons. Here, I will not have time to go into the details, which you are probably all familiar with, but basically, with regard to the first strategy, Priest shows that the Tarskian representation of language according to a hierarchical picture of different linguistic ranks does not work for natural language. And actually, this was recognized by Tarski himself, who believed that our ordinary language to be semantically closed. And he believed that the image of the hierarchy of language could only apply to artificial languages. To give only one example, just think, as Priest notes, to this sentence. The sentence says, all the sentences of my talk are true. This is a sentence that attributes a truth value to itself and does not distribute the truth value within the supposed hierarchy of language. At the same time, it is a clear, correct sentence, and considering that there is at least one false sentence in my talk, it has a determinable and determined truth value. So with regard to the second strategy, namely the criticism of the principle of equivalence, Priest claims that the liar sentence is not a good candidate to join the set of sentences with no truth value. Actually, if we consider a sentence like the following, this sentence is true. This sentence is to be a perfect candidate to join the set of sentences with no truth value. Because there are no good reason to ascribe this sentence to the set of sentences, to the set of true sentences rather than to the set of false ones. This sentence is true, actually is O underdetermined. But in the case of the liar sentence, so this sentence is false, we meet the opposite situation, because there actually are good reason to attribute the liar sentence to the liar sentence both truth and falsehood. Therefore, one can and probably should assign the liar sentence to the class of sentences that have more than one truth value. That is to say, truth and falsehood, precisely because the sentence is overdetermined. Moreover, it is not reasonable to assign the liar sentence to the class of sentences that have no truth value, because the only justification we have for this move is the need to escape the paradox and the consequent violation of the law of contradiction. But this is, of course, not a good justification, because it is not independent from what I wanted to show in the first place, namely that the liar paradox is not paradoxical at all. But Priest doesn't stop here. In fact, Priest shows that all the solution based on the two strategy I mentioned follows the formulation of a new version of the paradox called the revenge liars. In these new versions, the liar paradox is reformulated in terms of the notion employed in the theories that were meant to solve it. For example, in relation to the solution based on the distinction between linguistic ranks, it is possible to reformulate the paradox as follows with this sentence S. The sentence S is not true at its ranks. And in relation to the second strategy to solve the paradox, namely the criticism of bivalence and the omission of gaps, it is possible to reformulate the paradox as follows. This sentence S is not true. So in this way, Priest shows not only that all the solutions to the liar paradox do not work, but also that this same solution generates the contradiction, and that it is the very nature of our language that implies the contradiction we encounter in paradoxes. Priest concludes that since there doesn't seem to be any way to get rid of the contradiction, the most reasonable thing to do is to accept the contradiction as true, and to learn to deal with the contradiction and somehow learn to master the contradiction so as not to allow it to blow up the system. Interestingly, I think that Hegel assumes a similar strategy in his Dialectic. Because Hegel starts, normally he starts from the demonstrating that the strategy of the understanding, Verstand, aims at avoiding the contradictory character of the logical determination. But Hegel also shows that this strategy suffers the revenge of the contradiction, which is implied by the same strategy implemented to avoid it. This leads Hegel to think that the essence of the logical determination implies a contradiction. And like Priest, Hegel makes this explicit by showing that the content of the determination is inherently self-contradictory. I will recall just one example, which is the dialectic of the determination of the finite. In the doctrine of being, Hegel starts from the coherent characterization of the finite, in which the finite is opposed to the infinite. This is the most immediate way to think of the finite, which corresponds to the understanding's conception of the finite. In thinking what it means to be finite, the understanding tries to dispel contradiction. In his critical analysis of this conception, Hegel shows how precisely in the attempt to dispel contradiction, the characterization of the understanding ends up implying it. Being separated from the infinite, the finite is contradictorily absolutized. And I quote this passage from the Science of Logic. The understanding persists in this sort of finitude, for it makes non-being the determination of things, and at the same time, this non-being unperishable and absolute. Their transitoriness would only pass away in their other, in the affirmative. Their finitude would then be severed from them, but this finitude is their unalterable quality, that is, their quality which does not pass over into their other, that is, not into the affirmative, and so finitude is eternal. This is a very important consideration, but that the finite is absolute is certainly not a standpoint that any philosophy or outlook or the understanding would want to endorse. The opposite is rather expressly present in the assertion of finitude. The finite is the restricted, the perishable. The finite is only the finite, not the imperishable. So, insofar as the understanding relies on the law of contradiction and attempts to define the finite in a coherent way, by keeping the finite separate from the infinite, the understanding contradicts itself. The finite turns out to be an absolute finite, which is a self-contradictory conception of the finite. This is the starting point of the argument through which Hegel shows the impossibility of getting rid of the contradiction immanent in the structure of the finite. The first step, therefore, is the critical analysis of the abstract articulation of the finite as implied the contradictory conception of the finite itself. This leads to a second step. Hegel considered the thesis of the internal contradiction in the structure of the finite, which is implied by the dialectic of the finite itself. The finite is what ends, what ceases to be, what is then denied, and therefore it is the passing over into its other, that is, into its non-being itself. The finite is as much itself as its non-being. And I quote again from the Science of Logic, the finite is thus in itself the contradiction of itself. It sublates itself. It goes away and ceases to be. But this its result, the negative as such, is its very determination. For it is the negative of the negative. So in going away and ceasing to be, the finite has not ceased. It has only become a momentarily another finite, which equally is, however, a going away as a going over into another finite, and so forth to infinity. Hegel shows that it is reasonable to accept the contradiction internal to the logical structure of the finite, first by showing that the coherent characterization of the finite implies the contradiction it is intended to avoid. And secondly, that the analysis of the internal structure of the finite cannot fail to arrive at making this contradiction explicit. Therefore, for Priest, it is reasonable to accept the contradiction of the liar paradox, just as for Hegel it is reasonable to accept that the finite is inherently contradictory. This does not mean that in dialectic and in dialetheism it is reasonable to accept a contradiction such as the bachelor is married. In the case of the liar, as well as in the case of the finite, if we intend to follow the argument of Hegel and Priest, we should accept the contradiction that the liar and the finite imply as example of true contradiction on the basis of reasons that are not merely syntactic. These reasons are rooted, as far as the liar sentence is concerned, in the semantic of our natural language. In the case of the finite, the reason to accept the contradiction depends on the implications of the content of this logical category. Instead, in the case of the bachelor is married, it is difficult to find any good reason to accept this sentence is true. I have explained so far how one can use a non-syntactic criterion for distinguishing true contradiction from false contradiction in dialetheism and dialectic. But there is another problem that needs to be solved. How can one express the exclusion of what is unreasonable to accept as true, be it a simply false contradiction or any other belief without sufficient reason to believe? In the second part of the text, I will show why this can be a problem for both Hegel and Priest, and I will explain how dialectic and dialetheism can overcome this obstacle. I think I can stop here. So this was the first part of the text. I don't know if anyone has questions.
Okay, Michela, I've noticed that questions and answers tend to be rather lengthy. So I worry that if we stop at this point, we'll never get to the second part. Can I suggest that you go on and finish, and then we'll open the floor, okay?
Okay. Okay, the second part is focused on the notion of negation, exclusion, and falsity. So far, at least one fundamental point has been made clear. The thesis Priest and Hegel intend to support is that it is reasonable to admit the truth of some contradictions. However, both do not intend to renounce in any way to the possibility of affirming something determined, which seems to presuppose the possibility to think and say a content that excludes other contents. However, for dialectists and dialecticians, it is difficult to discard a thing that they do not want to accept as true or to express disagreement with rival philosophical positions. What does this difficulty consist in? In order to discard what is not acceptable or disagree with someone, it seems that for both the dialectist and the dialectician, negation is not enough. For example, if the dialectists say not A, this is in itself insufficient to rule out that A is the case, given that in dialetheism both A and not A can occur. The same thing happens if the dialectist uses the concept of falsehood. For the dialectist, the fact that A is false does not exclude that A may also be true. Truth and falsehood are, in this proposal, exhaustive. There are no gaps in truth value, but they are not exclusive. Some sentences can be either true, both true and false. It is no coincidence that with either negation or a concept of falsehood, it is impossible to implement exclusion, since these two concepts are interdefinable. As far as I know, Priest's way out of this problem consists in a non-standard treatment of the notion of rejection. Normally, the rejection of a belief is considered to be equivalent to the acceptance of the negation of the same belief. For Priest, this equivalence is not valid. Accepting not A is different from rejecting A, and this is evident in the case of true contradiction, A and not A. A dialectist can accept A and not A, but acceptance of not A does not imply that A is rejected. In fact, not A is true as well as A. Thus, according to Priest, A and not A are compatible. Both can be true. While acceptance and rejection are not compatible. In an 1989 article, Priest writes the following, and I quote, "Someone who rejects A cannot simultaneously accept it any more than a person can simultaneously catch a bus and miss it, or win a game of chess and lose it. If a person is asked whether or not A, he can of course say yes and no. However, this does not show that he both accepts and rejects A. It means that he accepts both A and its negation. Moreover, a person can alternate between accepting and rejecting a claim. He can also be undecided as to which to do, but do both he cannot." Okay. Thus, in order to exclude what she does not intend to accept, the dialectist can use the notion of rejection. This means that in order to exclude A, it is not enough to assert this negation. In fact, it is necessary to reject A. Here, I do not intend to analyze the debate on the problem of exclusion in the dialectist approach. So what I will do is just analyze some implication of Priest's approach to this problem in the contemporary debate on the law of contradiction, and above all, my interest is its relation to Hegel's theory of contradiction. So the possibility to exclude something through rejection tells something important about Priest's theory and its ability to admit contradictions. Priest can admit syntactic contradictions, that is, it is possible that A and not A. He can also admit semantic contradiction, that is, it can happen that A is both true and false. I will not mention the case of ontological contradiction, which I think is particularly problematic. And but I want to talk about pragmatic contradiction. And I think that one can see that Priest can also admit pragmatic contradiction, but only of a certain kind. In fact, we have two kinds of pragmatic definition of contradiction. That is, the contradiction can occur at the level of our belief and our linguistic acts in two ways. The first kind of pragmatic contradiction is when a rational agent accepts both A and not A. And the second kind of pragmatic contradiction occurs when we have a rational agent that accepts and rejects A. The two things are, of course, different. In the first case, the corresponding law of contradiction asserts the impossibility of thinking and conceiving contradictions. In the second kind of pragmatic contradiction, the corresponding law of non-contradiction states the impossibility of thinking contradictorily. For Priest, I think the contradiction of the first kind may occur, but not of the second. The consequence of Priest's position is particularly relevant because it appears that there is a formulation of the law of contradiction that Priest is obliged to accept, or which he cannot reject. Indeed, the Priest can reject the formulation of the pragmatic law of contradiction corresponding to the first type of pragmatic contradiction mentioned above. That is, he can reject the law of contradiction according to which it is impossible to accept a belief as much as its negation. However, it seems that Priest is obliged to accept the pragmatic formulation of the law of contradiction corresponding to the second type of pragmatic contradiction, because in his theory, acceptance and rejection are incompatible. This means that he is forced to accept the pragmatic formulation of the law of contradiction according to which it is impossible for a rational agent to accept and reject at the same time and in the same respect a certain belief. But things I think are much more complicated with Hegel. Let's see how Hegel, how things work in Hegel philosophy when it comes to rejection or the exclusion of a belief. And my problem is also, is there a formulation of the law of non-contradiction that even Hegel cannot refuse? The answer to the first question is simple, because I think that to reject a belief or to exclude something, Hegel can use the notion of falsehood. This is something that dialectics cannot do, because in dialecticism, true contradiction are sentences that are both true and false. For a dialectist, truth and falsehood are exhaustive, but they are not exclusive. This is not true, I think, for Hegel, because when Hegel claims that some contradictions are true, he's referring to a conceptual content expressed by two contradictory sentences that are both true, and not two sentences that are both true and false. If we consider the logical space of truth in Hegel, we can say that truth and falsehood are exhaustive. Okay. I think that in Hegel's logic there is no space for proposition with no truth value. But at the same time, in the same logical space, I think that truth and falsehood are exclusive. that is, the true contradictory proposition expressed in speculative truth are both true var together, and they cannot be also false. What I want to say is that these two propositions separately considered, they can be both true and false in the sense of being correct and incorrect, richtig and unrichtig. Anyway, conjunctively considered, they are true as moments of the same unity, and they are true only within this unity. This is clear, for example, if we consider Hegel characterization of the result of the reciprocal determination of finite and infinity. This passage, I always thought this is particularly interesting when it comes to dialectic and dialetheism. Let's see what Hegel claims. The claim is made that the finite and the infinite are one unity. This is one of the two contradictory sentences. This is false. This is a false claim that needs correction by its opposite. The two are absolutely different and opposed. This claim is in turn to be corrected, and so it is false, to the effect that the two are inseparable. That in the one determination there lies the other by virtue of the claim to unity, and so forth to infinity. The resolution, and the problem here is to understand what resolution means. The resolution of this contradiction is not the acknowledgement of the equal correctness and of the equal incorrectness of both claims. This would only be another shape of the still abiding contradiction. But the resolution of this contradiction is the ideality of both, in the sense that in their distinction as reciprocal negation, they are only moments. So in these lines, Hegel uses the notion of falsehood as equivalent to the notion of partial and one-sided true, which is compatible with Richtigkeit, but not with Wahrheit. Anyway, in other places of the science of logic, I can also use the notion of falsehood to mean what is simply false. For example, when he's critically analyzing, Kant's criticism of the ontological proof of Cadex system, Hegel claims the following. This so-called concept of $100 is, however, a false concept. The form of simple self-reference does not belong to such a limited finite content itself. Therefore, I am quite convinced, but not 100% convinced. I am quite convinced that Hegel can use the notion of falsehood to express exclusion. However, we need to pay attention to the ambiguous meaning of Hegel's notion of falsehood, which can express both the rejection of what is simply false, but also what is only correct, richtig, but not true, wahr. Hegel, differently from Priest, can use falsehood to express the exclusion while claiming that some contradictions are true, because he uses a type of negation that is different from the classical one. And the classical one, which is also the negation used by Priest in his dialectic theory. In classical logic and in dialetheism, negation is interdefinable with the concept of falsehood. In Hegelian logic, I think this is not valid. And I just want to read the last quotation. Because the result, the negation, is a determinate negation, it has a content. It is a new concept, but one higher and richer than the preceding. Richer because it negates the or opposes the preceding, and therefore contains it. And it contains even more than that, for it is the unity of itself and its opposite. Therefore, so far from being equivalent to the falsehood of a conceptual content of a logical determination, the negation of that determination is equivalent to the internal development of that content. That is to say, it corresponds to a new, more concrete, more articulated, and thus truer content. The The negation of a logical determination, therefore, is a new determination opposite to the first one, but it is at the same time the unfolding of the immanent content of that first determination. Therefore, the new determination as a determinate negation of the first in no way implies its falsity, but on the contrary, it unfolds its truth. Regarding to the second question concerning the formulation of the law of contradiction that even Hegel cannot refuse, I will only consider the two pragmatic formulations of the law of contradiction I mentioned above. In my interpretation of the logic, Hegel rejects the first formulation of the pragmatic law of contradiction, which asserts the impossibility of thinking contradiction. In this sense, Hegel's line of thought is the same as Priest's. Regarding to the second formulation, which asserts the impossibility of thinking contradictorily, things are more problematic. Is Hegel obliged like Priest, to assume the validity of this principle? I run the risk of saying that I do not think so. In effect, speculative thinking is a thinking without presupposition. And therefore, it cannot dogmatically assume the validity of any principle. But then we need to ask one question. Even if Hegel does not assume the pragmatic version of the law of contradiction, can Hegel avoid contradicting himself and thinking the contradiction in a non-contradictory or in a coherent way? My hypothesis is that the coherence of speculative thought is not a formal one, but a coherence that is rooted in the content of thought determination, and that in the very nature of, and then in the very nature of a speculative thought itself. A thought, in fact, can only contradict itself insofar as it is understood as a faculty of a subject of a rational agent intending to understand a determinate object. But speculative thinking is not identifiable with the instrument of a rational agent that accepts or rejects certain mental contents. Speculative thinking is not contradictory, or we can say it is coherent, even when it thinks contradiction, because it does nothing but follow the intrinsic unfolding of logical determinations. In fact, speculative thinking is this unfolding itself. This means that the reflection performed by speculative thought is nothing more than the internal reflection of the logical determinations themselves. Thought impossibility of contradicting itself is not based on the presupposition of some principle, but consists in thoughts being firm in following the development of intrinsic content of logical determinations, which is its own process of development. That is the process of self-determination of one's own thought willing to unfold the truth of logical determinations. The incontrovertibility of speculative thinking, even in thinking about contradiction, consists in being faithful to itself, that is, to the way in which it necessarily articulates itself based on its own logical nature and on the categorical contents in which this logical nature is unfolded. Therefore, speculative thinking thinks certain logical contents that can be contradictory, but this logical content and its contradictory structure is held firmly as the truth of the determination that generates it. And in this sense, in no way can it be accepted and at the same time rejected or denied. The consistency of speculative, the coherence of speculative thinking is based on this absolute firmness, even when it comes to thinking contradiction. The same firmness is the reason why, looking back at the quotation I mentioned at the beginning, and I quote again, speculative thought consists only in this, in holding firm to contradiction and to itself in the contradiction. So based on this firmness, on this content coherence, speculative thinking does not fall prey to contradiction, but can dominate it and thus be able to think beyond the limits that affect common thinking, classical logic, and perhaps even Dialetheism itself. So thank you guys for the attention.
Thank you, Michela. Okay, well, Michela's left us a good long time for discussion. So I might plug myself into the queue at some stage, but not yet. Let's open it up to people who want to talk about Hegel. And I will take questions in the order that the hands appear. So maybe I should look at the hands. Okay, Elena.
Hi, Michela, thank you very much for your nice talk. I liked some of the quotations very much. Some of them were structurally very important to make the point you want to make. But I just have some clarificatory questions. The first one is about your use of the concept or the term syntax or syntactic in order to explain why, if I'm right, but you can correct me, perhaps I misunderstood, but so you say there isn't a principle you want to make the point that you do not have in Hegel's logic a criterion, a universal criterion in order to distinguish between true and false contradictions, right? And so you talk about syntactic point of view. And I was just wondering about the fact that so this use probably is a heuristic on your part. So because it is not Hegelian to distinguish between syntax and semantics. And I'm not sure that Graham would go along with it, but I don't know. So perhaps you can say a little bit more about this idea, about this distinction between the syntactic perspective and the non-syntactic one. What is the non-syntactic one? Why? So why do you distinguish at all? And then I have a question about a quotation, quotation 6. Isn't it something Hegel says about the bad infinity? Right? Just wanted to know, is it about the bad infinity? And then there's two other questions about quotation 8 and quotation 9. False concept. Would you distinguish between false sentences and would you say Hegel would deny that there are false sentences or would admit that there are false sentences? Why does he use why does he talk about false concepts in order to express what you say, namely Hegel does conceive falsity as a tool of rejection. But why false concepts and not false sentences? And then can you please give me the German page of quotation 8? That's all.
Okay, thank you, Elena. I can just say that I don't have the answer for question 4. I can look at it and give the page number after the talk, but I don't have the German version here, so I cannot answer the last question. So very interesting question. Syntax. Of course, I am distinguishing when it comes to Hegel. I am distinguishing between syntactical criterion and formal or content criterion, which for Hegel is the same. because form and content with Hegel logic, when it comes to Hegel logic, are equivalent. And syntactic criteria mean the form of sentences that express logical, the content of logical determination. So, for example, when we consider Brandon's reading of Dialectic, for him, it is when some contradiction appear in the dialectical process, the contradiction and the syntactic form of contradiction is sufficient in order to rule out that very content, insofar as it is syntactically contradictory. But I think that Hegel has a criterion for distinguishing true contradiction from false one. Of course, as in Priest's case, and if I'm wrong, the Grant can correct what I say. For them, both for Hegel and Priest, the criterion is not syntactic. It depends on other kinds of justification. In Hegel case, is the content of logical determination, but as I already said, the content and form for Hegel's logic are the same. But the form is not syntax. No, does not have anything to do with the syntax of the sentences that express the content of a logical category. The second is quotation 6. It is in the passage to from finite to infinity. So we have the finite, which is absolutized, but then Hegel analyzed the very nature of the finite and make explicit that in order to think a finite, I need to think what ceases to be. But what ceases to be passing another finite, and so on to infinity. This is the first appearance of the notion of infinity in the dialectic of infinity, which is the result of the infinite passage of the infinite finite. Okay. False concept, false sentences. I was thinking about
just one question about the last answer you gave me. So, and you quoted 6 in order to say what? What was the point again? Can you repeat it?
The necessity for finite to pass on, to pass over into each other and then to infinity, and so the fact that finite is itself and not itself, and so the contradictory nature of the finite. Of course, it would be much more clear if I quoted the following passage, but then I would have to analyze all the dialectic between finite and infinity. But the first appearance of infinity, the most immediate appearance of infinity is the result of the infinite passage of each finite into another finite. This is the most immediate meaning of infinity in the science of logic. Of course, infinity is much more than that, but then we should unfold the dialectic of infinity itself. Okay,
go on.
Okay. False concept, false sentences. The biggest problem for me, I was thinking about that yesterday night when I was reading the paper, is to understand, first of all, which are the bearer of falsity. And this is a problem that we need to also when we think of the theory of truth. Actually, I need to specify in the first place that Hegel uses, I think, the notion of falsity to rule out something that is just false, not correct, but just false. He does that mainly the remarks, and not in the unfolding of the dialectic of the determination. My impression is that when he's talking about the unfolding of the dialectic of the determination, he uses falsity as equivalent to what is partially true in the sense of correct. But the problem is that what is correct is also incorrect. There is richtig and unrichtig. So here for sentence, he uses this occurrence is not part of the unfolding of the dialectical determination. So I don't think this is really relevant to understand how Hegel's theory of truth and falsity works. I just want to notice that Hegel also uses falsity in this more common sense. Yeah? But then when it comes to the unfolding of the dialectical unfolding of logical determination, I think that falsehood as well as true, when we talk of falsehood as well as true, the bearers are logical determination which are expressed by sentences. But I would say that the primary, the most important bearer of truth and falsehood are the logical determination. It's strange because when it comes to the expression of the contradictory structure of logical determination, we have a weird situation which you described very elegantly in the paper about the paradox, yeah. And you have two sentences. They are true together, but isolatedly considered, they are false in the sense that they are not correct. They are correct and incorrect at the same time, actually. Or at least this is what Hegel claims with respect to, for example, to infinity, but also there is not a passage where he says the same about the dialectic of being and nothing. I don't know if I answered your question. I don't know. Let me know if I can say something more or something more precise.
Do you want to come back on this?
It's fine. You can answer Greg and Alessandro.
Okay.
Thank you, Elena.
I think you were next, Greg.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michela, for a very stimulating talk. And it's the second time I read it or listened to it. So yeah, first I just had a general comment. I was thinking about the first part of the paper, and I agree with everything in the first part of the paper. And I was thinking about a passage in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason where he argues that there cannot be a formal principle of truth. And I thought that might be an interesting connection with Hegel and your discussion of priests, that like Kant, they both reject this idea that we could just develop a formal principle of truth that in Kant's terms abstracts from all the content. And he gives an argument about why that's impossible. That might be an interesting, something interesting to link up with that discussion. Just to comment, to connect it with the tradition there, which seems very plausible. Not to have such a principle seems absurd. I wanted to ask you about the false. You knew I was going to ask you about the false. The quote that you posted was very helpful. I'm going to have to go back and look at this quote about the equal correctness and incorrectness. So I'll just have to sit on that for a little while and come back to you with another question later. But I just wanted to kind of give an argument and to ask you what you thought of this argument and what you would do with something like this. So I was thinking about, I think a claim that you kept in the paper, which is about how the false can express exclusion, right? I think that's what you say. And you read Hegel as saying that truth and falsehood are exclusive in Hegel anyway, right? Is that correct? Right. Unlike in pre-Dialetheism, where the same propositions can be true and false, right? Okay, so this is, even though you'll accept true contradictions in Hegel, you have this idea of truth and falsehood being exclusive in Hegel. So this is what I wanted to ask, and maybe this is an equivocation on correctness and truth, and I'm curious about how you would understand this kind of argument. So if truth and falsehood are somehow excluded, and the false can express exclusion, what I'm wondering is whether, in the case of Hegel, this would lead to a view of truth that's, well, one-sided, a view of truth that would be false, a view of truth that would exclude the false and therefore be false itself. And so to have a true concept of truth would be, following the Differenzschrift, would be to think of contradiction as the form of truth, namely that the truth would be both true and false. And that would be a true concept of the truth, exactly because in this vision of truth, we wouldn't have this exclusion of falsehood. So is that an equivocation on Richtigkeit and Wahrheit? The reason I ask is that we have this kind of the falsehood of the one-sidedness, right? And on the other hand, we have this mutual exclusion of true and false. So what I'm wondering is whether the truth is always one-sided and whether that doesn't make it false. I hope my question makes sense.
Yes, it makes sense, but it is a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, of course, and I'm just out loud.
But,
no,
because we need to understand. First thing, thank you about the comment. For the comment about Kant.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but we need to remember that for Kant, the law of contradiction is a negative condition for truth. And this is the difference between Kant and, on the one hand, and Princeton Hegel on the other hand. But it's really interesting because it helped me to clarify the main point of the first part of the paper. Truth and falsehood are exclusive, and this would turn truth one-sided. Because it seems that for you, truth and falsehood cannot be, do not have to be exclusive.
That's right. Yes, I would take
in order to avoid the one-sidedness of the conception of truth.
Right. So that's my inclination right now, is to say that that truth itself is not one-sided. Yeah. And that would mean that the true as true would also be false. And that would be a way of articulating this idea that contradiction is the form of truth, as you see in the Differenzschrift. But that's a very so it's also me just putting together these two ideas that are kind of in your paper, right? There's just that falsehood is a kind of exclusion, and we have this exclusion of true and false in Hegel. And so then I'm wondering whether that exclusion is in itself false, or this is why I'm asking about whether what I'm doing is taking Richtigkeit and identifying it with Wahrheit in a problematic way. I mean, I'm open to that, but I'm wondering whether,
the problem
we don't
is
get
that
ourselves into trouble. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
The problem is that when you say that, you need to explain what you mean by falsehood, because and we need I think that the concept of falsehood in Hegel is always contextual. It has some meanings in the phenomenology, some other meanings in the first Jena writings. In the logic, it is something really specific. I would run the risk to say that in the logic, there's nothing that is just false.
I would agree with
because even, for example, the understanding's conception of infinity or the finite is partly is part of the truth, so it is correct with respect to the truth as a whole. I think the logic, as if it was the logical space of truth, which is which needs to run through a kind of what Anton Koch called evaluation of the logical space.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there is a kind of gradual or processual, no, I don't say how to say that in appropriate English, a kind of a processual theory of truth.
Developmental or something, yeah.
Developmental, thank you. Angelica Nuzzo has a nice paper on this. The problem, for example, Angelica, in that papers, attacks the use of truth and falsity with respect to Hegel's logic, as if I could apply the truth or false to a logical content as a kind of truth coin theories of truth.
Yeah.
That is the theory of someone who uses, of course, thought in a classical way as an instrument to understand a determinate object. The problem is that this is not what is going on in the logic. So for me, talking about the exclusion of truth and falsity and falsehood is problematic. What is not problematic? I think there is an exclusion of truth and falsity. In the logic, I think we have just a truth that developed itself. But what is not exclusive is not truth and falsehood, but a content and its opposite.
I see.
And determinate negation. I'm trying to think, and the point that I think I am, that this is a confession. The point I'm not sure about my paper, and I don't know how to solve it, is that for me, I think that in Hegel's logic, determinate negation is not interdefinable with the notion of falsehood as in classical logic, in the same way as it is in classical logic.
Yeah, that's very.
But I'm thinking about this problem, and I just.
Yeah, no.
I also curious what you think about this.
Yes.
But in classical logic and in phrase theory, falsehood is interdefinable with negation. And please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, yeah. So I just a couple comments briefly on what you said. I have no easy answers to your quandary or your question that you're asking and thinking about. I guess you'll illuminate that in your book, right, when it comes out, or at least the problem more clearly. But I would agree that there is no category of the logic that is strictly speaking just false. And for me, the question is whether, however, there are categories that are both true and false, rather than just true. So I feel like that's in some way what we're thinking through together, right? And
I have a.
Sorry, just real briefly, just I feel like you're exactly right. We have to be careful how we use the notion of truth. And in particular, it's best probably for us to open up the science of logic and to look at the idea and to think about truth as this unity of concept and object, and to think about falsehood in somehow, I think, in connection with that. We haven't really been speaking about it in the discussion really, but I don't know if that would help at all or just confuse things even more. But
no, I think that there is a sense in which each category is true and false. And we saw that this, for example, with the finite and infinity.
Yeah.
When you say that the finite and infinity are the same and they are not the same, they are opposite. Hegel claims that the two sentences are richtig and unrichtig, which is equivalent to what in standard logic we mean when we say true and false.
Yeah.
The weird thing is that you have the conjunction that is true only the two moments are considered together. The weird thing is that this same unity turns out to be only correct and not vara in the context of further development of the logical determination.
But maybe I could put a quick finger on this, because in modern logic, the notion of falsity is ambiguous. Okay, it can mean having a true negation, or it can mean not true. So it's a question of whether the negation comes inside the scope of the truth operator or outside. Okay, so it's not true or true not. All right. Now, if you study classical logic, you'll be told that these two things are equivalent. As soon as you have truth value gaps or truth value gluts, things which are both true or false or neither true or false, these things come apart. Okay. So you certainly find in modern logic people sliding between the two, usually because they've been told in Logic 100 that they're equivalent. But once truth value gaps and truth value gluts are on the table, this is a distinction you must draw. Okay, that's the comment about modern logic. Now, whether Hegel uses falsity to mean one or other of these, or whether he himself slides between the two, unaware that he's sliding, I'm not enough of a Hegel scholar to note. But that distinction between having a true negation and not being true is kind of crucial to bear in mind once you're in the sort of dialectic territory.
But my question, I have another question. In your theory, isn't negation used like in a classical logic?
No.
Doesn't negation work?
In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. Let me be more precise. Look, in the semantics I give, negation works in the same way as classical logic in the following sense, namely that something is false if and only if its negation is true. So the way I've always tried to use the word is that to be false is to have a true negation. And in that way, I agree with classical logic. But where I would disagree with classical logic is that that is not the same as not being true.
Mm-hmm.
So classical logic assumes that truth and falsity are exclusive and exhaustive. That's where, in a paraconsistent logic, one must say no. But in a sense, the truth conditions for negation are the same. It's just a view about the exclusivity of truth and falsity, where classical logic and paraconsistent logic differ.
Can you define negation without the notion of falsity?
No, no one can. No, okay. No one can do that. I mean, falsity and negation, however you think the relationship holds, you can only define one in terms of the other. I mean, it's a small circle, and it's a small circle that everybody faces. Doesn't matter who they are.
Now, that's my problem. That's my problem with Hegel's notion of negation in the logic, because the notion of negation in Hegel's logic does not seem to. I think it does. Hegel doesn't try to present a notion of negation which does not seem to imply the falsehood of something. But the problem then for him is how to define this notion of negation.
Well, you can't define everything. We learned that with Aristotle 2,000 years ago. Sooner or later, you hit things which can't be defined. And sometimes you're going to meet a small bunch of negations, a bunch of notions which are interdefinable. That happens too. Somewhere or other, you've got to hit bedrock, okay? So asking for a definition of everything is impossible. Where the bedrock occurs in Hegel, I leave Hegel scholars to argue about. Anyway, that was my finger. Alex.
Yes, thank you, Graham, and many thanks, Michela. It was a very, very, very rich and interesting. I have just a quick remark on what Gregory was saying. If I'm not mistaken, Hegel talks about the false as a moment of the true. So a moment is the precise term Hegel uses in order to express this developmental character of falsity with relationship to truth. And maybe an interesting thing is that this is Hegel's true Kantian heritage, namely that a good criterion in order to distinguish between, so to say, true falsehood and false falsehood. I believe maybe new idealism uses the term concrete and abstract falsehood is to investigate the necessity of this false as a moment of the development of the true. Namely, it is true, it is part of logic when it is necessary, namely when it is not an arbitrary abstraction, but rather it is in the things, it is in the notion. What you said in the late part of your paper, namely that's why I talk about a Kantian heritage, because it's somehow how also the antinomies work. So it is false, but it is necessary. So that's maybe part of the discussion. I wanted to say three things. The first one is very quick. I do believe that the distinction you make between false and correct is really crucial, and it is maybe a very important thing to keep in mind when we go on our quest to find passages in Hegel's work when he endorses or rejects the contradiction, for instance, because I believe there is an element of confusion when we speak about the truth of contradiction in Hegel's logic. But this was also only a remark. Namely, I really believe the distinction you make between falsity and falsehood and correctness is absolutely crucial. Two questions. First of all, the liar's paradox. I was also thinking about Elena and Franca's article about the liar's paradox in how Hegel discusses it mainly. And I was thinking about the lectures on the history of philosophy when he discusses the Megaric paradoxes, for instance. And what strikes me is that in those passages, the problem is that doesn't really seem to be the principle of contradiction, but rather the law of the excluded middle. So the whole analysis is all about exclusion, and something that Hegel repeats almost obsessively is the distinction between simplicity and complexity. So he says the problem is we are impossibilitated to think when we are asked the question and we are obliged to give a simple answer. So the dialectic is all about the rejection of this simplicity. And I'm under the impression that that's what I find really interesting in Elena's and Franca's reconstruction. I'm under the impression that Elena and Franca do see Hegel's analysis as an endorsement of, as a rejection of the law of contradiction, whereas another possible interpretation is precisely to argue that Hegel does think that dialectics is precisely the rejection of this exclusive nature of the opposite. So in a way, if the opposites are no longer exclusive, you don't have any contradiction anymore. It is simply stated. And in a way, this is also, I believe, the interpretation of the liar's paradox given by Severino in Italy. It's very, very complicated, but he wrote a part of one of his books about this. And it is precisely the idea that you can solve the liar's paradox by stating in which sense you can say, I'm telling the truth and I'm lying, and still not expressing a contradiction. That's one possible answer. But so summarizing, what I want to ask you about is in Hegel's discussion of the liar's paradox, there seems to be at least a distinction between exclusive nature of the opposites and contradiction. We have been discussing about it with Gregory. Maybe this is another occasion to ask the question with a textual reference. Third point, I'm sorry, I have to make reference to your book because I've been reading it again in the last days, and I'm under the impression that in the end of your paper, you somehow propose this model of the coherent incoherency, right? So this idea that according to Hegel, there could be a way, so to say, there can be a first level inconsistency, but not a meta inconsistency, so to say. And in your book, you do criticize that model. You say that it is not very Hegelian, so to say, to speak about this second level coherence, second level consistency. And I'm under the impression that in your paper you tried to change Kierkegaard's and Rescher's argument by stating that this second level coherence is not a second level coherence, but it is in the structure of logic itself. It is in the notions themselves. But the only thing I'm pushed to do, I'm sorry if it's trivial or even stupid, is to ask you again the question, namely, if the lack, so if the impossibility of this, so to say, meta incoherence is in the notions themselves, is in the structure of logic itself, then this very structure cannot be the so to say, the garantia, the thing that lets us so be sure that there won't be such a meta structure. Namely, said otherwise, I'm sorry if I'm not clear right now, but it was an unclear question in my mind in the first place.
I think I got it.
But let me try and formulate it in just one sentence. What if we have to follow the structure of the word, if you have to follow the structure of thought, and if we have, so to say, to follow things themselves, how can we exclude the possibility that sometimes and eventually things in themselves, the things in themselves will start being contradictory in this second sense at this meta level, and that they won't keep and that they will keep being consistent in this second level you mentioned. I hope it's at least a little bit clear.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro. Lot of interesting things and questions. Yes, at the beginning you mentioned the point that false is the moment of the truth. Of course it is, but here false means what is partly var or what is richtig. So we always need to make explicit what false means also in this case. And of course, this reference to Kant, to the Kantian heritage, is crucial because it's exactly the necessity of contradiction that justifies which contradiction are true and which contradiction does not need to take into consideration in the dialectical unfolding of the logic. Then you mentioned the point, the difference between Richtigkeit and Wahrheit. I think that really it is something I'm thinking in the last month, because I think that is what really can explain in which sense Hegel is a dialectist. A dialectist in a priest sense. I think that Hegel is a dialectist in Priest's sense when we are talking about Richtigkeit and Unrichtigkeit. And I think that Hegel would say that Dialetheism is richtig. It's correct. It is the best thing you can do when you are working with standard logical tools. But as we said a lot of time in our discussion, he would probably say that it is not Vara, in the sense that dialectism does not say everything it considered to be the whole truth. Because it is not the whole truth that implies a kind of reflection on the content of logical determination, which are not at issues in Graham field. And then the liar, this is really important. I've been thinking about the problem and Hegel's reading of the liar since I read some of Elena's publications, which are always really good to make things clear and having some, there are really interesting ideas in Elena's articles about the liar. We need to remember, I think, that when we are talking about the liar, we are not in the logic. So he's talking about, so we cannot use the theory of truth that he analyzes with respect to the liar paradox to clarify how the theory of truth works in the logic. So we need to keep the two things distinguished, I think. Because actually here he's talking about a sentence. A sentence which can be true or false, and he is really clear about this. He says that it is both true and false. My intuition, but I'm not sure about this, is that he's using truth and falsity in the lecture, even if he uses wahr and falsch, he's using wahr and falsch in a non-technical sense. And actually, this truth value are attributed to sentences.
So you mean that, in your opinion, is using wahr und falsch as richtig and unrichtig, or are you saying something else?
It's an hypothesis.
Okay. Yeah, but is this your hypothesis?
Because sentences are not the bearer of Wahrheit and Falsheit. In an Hegelian technical meaning, sentences are bearer of Richtigkeit and Unrichtigkeit. And it's not a case that Hegel's position is the same as Priest with respect to the liar paradox. But there is one interesting thing with respect to the paradox. You mentioned the principle of excluded middle. I know there's a difficult relation between the principle of excluded middle and the principle of equivalence. But when he mentioned the principle of the simplicity of truth, and he says that the truth need to have the form of identity, I think he has in mind, he has at least the intuition that at the base of the paradox, is the principle of bivalence. And it's strange because he does something that is really similar to Priest's analysis, because he considers both the solution of the fools that answer to the liar paradox with no answer, so the gaps strategy. But he also considers, when he mentioned Aristotle, of course he does not any idea of the hierarchical conception of language, but he mentioned, referring to Aristotle, the strategy of parametrization. And he said that it does not work. And he mentioned the principle of the identity of truth, and I think he has in mind the principle of bivalence. But he said the gaps, the solution does not work. I need to go in another way, which is admitting that the liar is both true and false, as Elena demonstrates in the paper he wrote with Franca. So just to clarify that, I think there is the problem of the excluded middle, but I would focus more on, I would be more explicit. I would say that he has in mind the principle of bivalence, because the two predicates that cannot be attributed to the same sentence are truth and falsity. I cannot attribute the same. Normally, standardly, I cannot attribute the two opposite predicates to the same sentence. So it seems to say that the problem here is that we have a simple sentence, but the truth value that I need to attribute to this sentence cannot be simple. So it's criticizing the principle of equivalence, I think.
Can I just remind you of one of the things that Hegel actually says, and I'll quote this, right, in his discussion of Eubulides and the liar. He says, and now I quote, but of course in translation, the liar sentence both lies and does not lie. Okay, no mention of truth whatsoever, a simple assertion of a contradiction. Okay, it's as clearly dialectic as you can be. And then he goes on to say, for we here have a union of opposites, lying and truth, and their immediate contradiction. So there he does bring the notion of truth in. I presume the word is var, but without checking the text, I wouldn't know. But it's where he brings truth in, it's actually a gloss on the bald contradiction he has just asserted.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he uses var and false.
Well, it's lying, it's not falsch. I don't know what the German word is. I mean, the rest of the text may talk about falsch too, but in this particular quotation, he uses the word lying. And of course, lying is not the same as talking falsely.
Yeah, but I don't remember, now I don't have the quotation in mind, but there are other places in that part that if I'm not wrong, he uses the notion of falsch or falsch. But
I'm sure you're right.
So the German is lügt und lügt zugleich nicht, lies and does not lie. So.
Yeah, the question is not the value, the truth value of the proposition, the subject. So what is discussing it? What is the liar doing? So he is saying that both propositions, so that he is lying and he is not lying, are true at the same time. That's okay. No, but it's what I wanted to ask in my question, and I absolutely agree with Michela that the problem is not an excluded middle. The problem is that what I'm under the impression that what Hegel is trying to say with his reference to simplicity and complexity is precisely that the problem of this simplistic account of truth is the idea that if I say that the liar is lying, then I'm automatically excluding that he is not lying. So I believe this is what he is arguing against. Mm-hmm. I don't want to so I'm sure it is a contradiction, of course. I don't believe that. I believe that that's it's a nuance. So one thing is to say that a contradiction is true, but it could be argued that in order for there to be a contradiction, you have to, so to say, keep faith to an exclusive account of negation. Otherwise, Aristotle basically agree with Hegel in this. So maybe I'm thinking more in Aristotelian terms than in modern logical terms. But what I want to stress is simply this. So the problem is the exclusive nature of negation, and that's the point Hegel is trying to make. Okay, we have two more questions in the queue. Michela, I'll give you the last word on this, then we're going to pass on.
I just want to mention just a small point about the last question Alessandro asked about the coherence, incoherence, and the meta level. Actually, by saying that we have a content coherence, I really wanted to exclude the idea that there is the meta level of reflection, because the content coherence is internal to the development of the content itself. But I stop here because I think that we are running out of time. Thank you, Alessandro.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, Toby.
Well, thank you a lot, Michela, for this very helpful talk. And I think you do cut to the chase with this question of whether or not we find an informative criterion for telling the difference between true and wrong contradiction. This is extremely helpful. And I'd like to test something because I tend to think that I have a rather different translation of certain terms in Hegel than you. were presenting. And this brings me to this discussion of Richtigkeit and Wahrheit, certainty and truth, because I have the tendency to think of truth not to be a property of propositions or mental states in Hegel. This is certainty. Sense certainty is, if you have justified, true, so to speak, belief, then this is a certain proposition you utter or a judgment, but this is not truth in this technical sense. Truth, I mean, he gives this very good example of the good state. A true state is a state that has a constitution which allows its people to participate in the will, in the political party proceedings. This is what makes a state true. So it's not, in the sense, it's not a property of a sentence or proposition. And I think this is crucial to keep in mind when it comes to these debates on certainty and truth. And this brings me to another question or another translation. I always tend to think that falsity is not exclusive as in classical logic in Hegel, but it's a gradual. And this brings me to what Alessandro said about simplistic accounts of falsity. I do agree with that. The more simple it is, the more false it is. That means that we can kind of translate falsity with abstractness. So being as opposed to non-being as nichts. Yeah, this is super abstract. And that means it is true, it is false, but it's not false in this either or logic. It needs to be augmented with more concrete determinations. And this is what the unfolding of the dialectics in the proceeding does. So make it more concrete, make it more certain, so to speak. And so this brings me to something that I find extremely helpful, which is something we don't find in the logics, but I think it re-emerges in the logics. It is to be found in the phenomenology of spirit. There is this extremely good example of a dialectics, which is the dialectics of lordship and bondship. So this is a true contradiction. This is really true, because freedom is to serve. I mean, this is a contradiction, and then we have to kind of spell it out. And in the unfolding of the phenomenology, there is a chapter which Hegel has named in a very beautiful name, a way. He called it the spiritual animal kingdom, das geistige Tierreich, and the deceit, der Betrug, or the matter at hand, die Sache at hand. And this is where he explicitly distinguishes between die Sache selbst and Ding. Yeah, and Miller translates this as the thing and the matter at hand. So this is like a difference. It's not the same, right? And this is kind of, I think, easily to put aligned with the idea of simplicity and complexity, because the context of the spiritual animal kingdom is, what is individuality? What does it mean to be an individual? And it's collaboration. So in order to be with others, in order to be myself, I need to be with others. And this is a very complex understanding of individuality, which is opposed to a simplistic one, according to which I just express myself. I don't need the others. I just am what I am, and then the collaboration with the others, they decide my own self-expressivity. And this is like a very good example for spelling out the difference of what it means to be dependent in something very substantial, what it doesn't mean to be an individual, or to be identical with myself. I need to be with others. And this is like the general tension. And this is what we have to come up with when it comes to from my point of view. This is a question. I think it's helpful to bring this together to the question of what makes a criteria informative, because we have to spell out to put it the Kantian will, the Realopposition. And the Realopposition is a material criteria. It is something that the matter needs to tell us. And the more concrete you spell out the tensions of an object, the more certain your proposition is, and the more true it is, so to speak. But this is nothing we can tell formally, but we have to look, so to speak, on the matter. And this is a shift. So if you might put it that way, a shift from perspective. You have to really look at the object and then be as concrete and precise as you can be in order to spell out its real contradictions. So I hope you can relate to what I was proposing, because it's kind of a slightly different approach to this core question of informative criteria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tobias. No, basically, I agree with you. So, with respect to the first point, which deals with the better of truth and falsity. Of course, they, in Hegel's case, they are not sentences, or primarily they are not sentences, but the content of logical determination. I think that Greg found a good definition of truth and falsity, where falsity, I think, is always a partial truth when a content corresponds or not correspond with its concept. And then it comes to falsity as a gradual perspective of a gradual conception of falsity. I agree, if and only if we mean by falsity, we mean something that can be partly correct. So, of course, at the beginning of the logic, we have the most abstract determination, being and nothing, which are simply abstraction, and so actually they are false. But false false in that case means that they do not explain anything of what is going on with actuality, with the word. I think that this logic has a metaphysical value. So falsity has this gradual meaning of abstraction, which is progressively overcome along the logic, but which never is equivalent to something that can necessarily needs to be completely ruled out. And then I always have a problem when it comes to the phenomenology. But there's an interesting passage of the phenomenology where Hegel says that the false is not the devil. And I think that the false is not the devil. But I think we find a different kind of example of a self-contradictory structure, which are interesting, but at the same time, the contradiction we meet in the phenomenology, according to my reading, are different from the contradiction that we meet in the logic, because they always highlight some kind of limit of the different figure of consciousness, of the different form of consciousness. The dialectic of the phenomenology is not the dialectic of the science of logic. There are, of course, some similarities, but the aim of the phenomenology is different from the aim of the logic. The phenomenology is the path of despair. The logic is the unfolding of what Hegel calls the reign of truth. Last thing, you presented, okay, of course, also you mentioned, for example, real opposition in Kant, and it's a perfect example of how you need to take into how syntactic form is not sufficient in order to understand what is going on in the logic. We need to take into account the content of thought determination. But I cannot say a lot more about this. I just agree with you. And thank you so much for the comments. I need to think more, especially about the difference between the logic and the phenomenology, which is also always something that is really problematic for me. Thank you.
Just very briefly, but this is something we shall find the time to further discussing on this, because I would disagree. This is not
okay. I think you guys do this, right? But let me push the discussion on that because the clock is ticking. Paul.
Thanks, Michela. I was going to ask a question about, a question about Verhalten, Richtigkeit, and so on. But in light of Toby's question, I want to sort of push that part of it, because I think there was stuff in his question that while you answered it, I mean, there were things, his question points in a lot of directions, I think. Like the true state, you know, is a state that lives up to the concept of a state or something like that. And the way that he talks about true in that sense, often you could slot in the word good, right? I mean, a good state is the one that lives up to the concept of a state. And that, you know, there's a sort of element of Plato in going on there, where the, you know, the true and the good are the, once you grasp them in the right way, you realize they're the same, and so on. But that reminded me of the type of discussion of judgments that he talks about as the most developed form of judgment when he's talking in the subjective logic, when he comes up with those judgments about, you know, acts and houses and things, right? You know, sort of human artifacts and so on. And he comes up with the example, you know, that this house is good. And again, I mean, you could pretty well paraphrase that in some sense by saying this house is true, right? I mean, you know, because it lives up, it's a good example of the concept of a house. Now, there's something really odd about those sorts of judgments, because the opposite is this house is bad. It's not, you know, this house is false. And good and bad, they don't look exclusive. I mean, you know, most acts, most houses are just indifferent, and that's what I take that he's trying to capture. And a bad house is a house nevertheless, right? I mean, for most things, if they don't, as it were, instantiate their concept, they're just not that sort of thing, right? You know, if to wheel out his earlier sort of boring examples about roses, I mean, if this flower is not a rose, it's not like a bad example of a rose, it's just not a rose. But a bad house is still a house, and so on. And also, those sorts of judgment, when you say the house is good or the house is bad, there seems something wrong to sort of translate that into the sentence, this house is good, is true. I mean, that sounds a sort of defamation of the thing. And I think it's because of the point that you pointed out, that sentences aren't true and false. They're richtig and not unrichtig. So once you get into those sorts of judgments, I mean, it's hard to really say what contradiction is, because contradictions, when we talk about contradictions in logical terms, you know, we're talking about P and not P, and true and, you know, false, those sorts of things. So I guess the thing is just taking Toby's sort of point really seriously, what the consequences of that are for pursuing the type of dialectic unraveling of Hegel, because it is primarily tied to sentences, right? I mean, you know, modern logic's all about sentences. It's not about houses.
I just have one question. Why you say that this house is good and this house is bad, that good and bad are not exclusive?
Sorry, that they're not exclusive.
When you mentioned it, good and bad.
I mean, I think evaluative judgments are usually the sort of things that there's a middle, that the thing's rather indifferent in the middle. They're like judgments like, you know, happy and sad, right? I mean, a lot of the time you're neither happy nor sad, you're just it, you know. They're scalar, such that, you know, good is positive, negative, bad's negative, and somewhere in the middle there's a sort of a zero. Look, has that feel of judgment about it?
Okay, but the fact that some houses are not good and either good, not bad, that doesn't imply that good and bad are not exclusive. Or I mean, is this the same house?
Exhaustive.
The same house?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was answering your question as if you said exhaustive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean that we can have houses that are good, houses that are bad, houses that are okay.
Yeah.
And they are still houses.
And they're exclusive but not exhaustive. So, but what's the implications of that for contradiction?
Don't know how to answer this question, honestly. Because when it comes to the theory of judgment, I'm trying to remember because it has been a while that I don't read this passage of the logic. If I'm not wrong, contradiction, or the only Hegel talks of contradictory judgment when it comes to infinite judgment, is that right? And not to judgment, and not to other sorts of judgment, but I'm honestly,
infinite judgments just collapse the notion of a judgment. I mean, it's he says, what does he say? They're senseless. I mean, they lose any. Once you lose the subject predicate structure as the claim, you just lose sense altogether. So infinite judgments are not really judgments at all.
They're self-contradictory judgment. I'm not sure I remember, I am right, but I think that contradictions come out, appear in the theory of judgment when he talks about infinite judgment. I don't remember other places in the theory of judgment when he talks about.
It sort of comes out around there because infinite judgments are like they're sort of like pure propositions sort of thing, right? Which have lost all indexicality. And that's the sort of way that he argues for it. So he's talked about the type of negation that's gone on earlier. It hasn't been contradiction, it's more been contrariety and so on. But I guess, I mean, in some sense, that's not all that important for the theory of judgment because they're just fairly low-level judgments, and the big judgments that he's interested in are these evaluative judgments about good houses, and they're like the judgment about the state, right? Saying this is a good state, or this is a true state. And at that level, it's hard to see, the judgment is, this is good. It's not, as it were, this is true. It's not the sentence, this is good, is true. that would be merely.
But it is as if it, sorry.
That would, good. Go ahead.
Good in that context, good, it is as if it would be, it is equivalent to truth, because it is saying that the state corresponds to its own concept.
Yeah, I think it's equivalent to truth in the sense that Toby was saying.
See, and I agree with that. It is as meaning, and it is a way to use true that is similar to the one that we meet in the folder of the logical determination, which are true, var, insofar as the content corresponds to its own concept, as well as the state corresponds to its own concept. Yes. In the case of Brazil, we don't have a good state.
Yeah, nor a true state.
Or it is a false. It is a false state.
Okay, look, we're nearly at 2 hours. Stefan, you just put your hand up. Is this very quick?
No, I think we can talk about it another session. So I think it's okay if I ask the question one other time.
Okay, thank you.
We don't have
So, Greg, are there any questions on YouTube?
I cannot hear. You are muted.
Greg, you there?
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Classic. I've got to unmute myself. It turns out there are no questions on YouTube right now. Maybe in the future there will be some. So.
All right. Okay, then I think this is a good place to wind up today. So thank you, Michela. Thank you for the interesting discussion. And many of these things will be continued, I'm sure. See you all next week.
Right. See you then.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye. See you.
Michaela. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.